And hello and welcome. So, I hope you've had a chance to join some of the lectures in our spring speaker series. Today's featured Critical Muslim Studies panel and the final event of the spring 2026 speaker series will be on Muslim chaplaincy in the U.S. today. My name is Connie Aziz, and I'm a graduate student at Zahra Institute. I'm also a physician practicing in Atlanta, Georgia. I'll be introducing our panelists and moderating the Q&A session after the presentation. As you listen to the presentations, I invite you to type any questions you might have into the chat box. We'll address as many as we can once the lecture concludes. If you need to step away early or would like to revisit the talk, a video recording will soon be available on Zahra Institute's YouTube and Facebook pages. Now, let me introduce you to our honored guests, Nora Zaki Mantas and Jaye Starr. Nora Zaki Mantas served as the chaplain at Dominican University in Chicago and as the advisor for Muslim student life at Vassar and Bard colleges in upstate New York. She is also the founder of MyMuslimChaplain.com, a consultation company for chaplaincy. Nora has a Master's of Divinity from the University of Chicago and Master's of Arts in Islamic Studies from Bayan Islamic Graduate School. Jaye Starr is a graduate of Hartford Seminary's Islamic Chaplaincy Program and an ICU chaplain at a Midwestern teaching hospital. She is also a facilitator with the Alternatives to Violence Project, running community trauma mitigation workshops, and serves on the board of the Association of Muslim Chaplains. With that, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to both of our speakers, Nora and Jaye.
Could we cue the slideshow up? And Nora, would you be willing to start us with an opening dua
Oh,
before we
yes, of course.
begin?
Yes. So thank you, Connie. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm going to start with recite Surah Al-Fatiha, the chapter of the opening. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawm ad-Din, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een, Ihdina as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, Sirat alladhina an'amta alayhim, Ghayr al-Maghdubi alayhim, Walad-Dallin. Ameen. Oh Allah, please make this gathering beneficial. Bring us peace in our hearts, especially as we just witnessed the horrific shooting in San Diego. May Allah bring peace and comfort and justice to the community suffering, and may our hearts come together. As Allah says in the Quran, وَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. Ameen. Please take it away, Jaye.
We can go ahead and switch over to the next slide here. Just a little disclaimer, I do serve on the board of the Association of Muslim Chaplains, but the talk here is me in an independent capacity today. If we could go back actually one more slide, that would be great. I'm just going to start off with what is a Muslim chaplain? Muslim chaplains have been in the United States and North America at large since the 1970s with the degree of prevalence, a little bit in the 1960s, though it has gained a lot of momentum in the more recent years. So a Muslim chaplain is a religious professional who provides spiritual care in an institutional setting. By professional, we mean somebody who has recognized training competencies, participates in a professional association that upholds a code of ethics. There are people who operate as lay chaplains as well. A lot of the early work by Muslim chaplains was done by those who didn't have the benefit of access to training or paychecks, quite frankly, as we had a lot of Black Muslim chaplains come into this field in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s before those existed. But when we think about now as a professional chaplain, we're really looking for people who have a set of training, and we'll talk more about what that looks like later. When we think about providing spiritual care in an institution, some of the areas that we're going to focus our talk in today are around meaning and purpose, awe and acceptance, rhythm, routine, and values and belonging, which is part of an assessment process that helps with specific intervention tools around those areas. And we'll share more about what that looks like in the different institutional contexts where Muslims typically serve, or where chaplains typically serve, which are university, corrections, military, healthcare, and then a category that we call community, which is a large cross-section of things from Islamic third spaces to masajid that are hiring chaplains, to police or fire departments, domestic violence shelters, a whole number of different places, and increasingly we're starting to see some private practice chaplains as well. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Nora.
Thank you, Jaye. Next slide, please. So this is actually a slide that Jay shared with me while we were preparing this, and just wanted to actually give you all a more concrete example of some of the work that chaplains do. So Chaplain Shama Mehta, she was a CPE supervisor. CPE means clinical pastoral education. And these supervisors, these teachers, they teach in a clinical setting. And so these are some of the things that she identified as spiritual needs for all humans. And you'll notice that this is not belonging to Islam or Muslims only, right? So you'll see acceptance of a situation or of self, excuse me, of self, by self, and others. I'm starting on the left, as you can see with my pointer. Meaning, so meaning and purpose, a framework of understanding assigned to the past, present, and future experiences, belonging, like as Muslims, or ethnic identity, language, etc., relationship to self, others, God, and the universe, because as Jay just explained, chaplains, we serve people who are not even in our faith tradition. By the way, we do not only serve Muslims by any means. Values, what is important, what guides decision making, rhythm, routine. And I know that Jay and I both have young kids, and especially if you have little ones like I do, rhythm and routine is so important for children, and of course for adults as well. And this definitely got interrupted with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then understanding of transcendence, right? And so for us, it would be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God, nature, the ayat of Allah, as God describes in the Quran, doesn't only mean God's words, right? But also nature, Allah's beautiful creation. Next slide, please. Jay, do you want to do this one, or would you like me to finish it?
Yeah.
Oh,
So when we come in as chaplains to work with somebody in an institution, one of the first things we start with is a spiritual assessment of looking to identify where is a person and where are their needs at this particular juncture where we're encountering them. When we find these needs aren't met, these are some of the ways that they can show up. So if somebody is struggling with acceptance, they might have a sense of being unforgivable. They might think that they're being punished. They may be in a place of despair, or they may be operating with really strong compartmentalization, which looks like I am not going to think about whatever diagnosis the doctor has given me. I'm going to push it over here, which can work for micro moments, but at some point we need to be able to bring that out and integrate it. When a person is lacking in a sense of meaning and purpose, we can see boredom, cynicism, a big focus on a victim mentality, and narcissism come up. When a person doesn't feel belonging, it shows up as disconnect and a lack of self-worth and isolation. This can be exceedingly detrimental. We see this a lot in institutions across America now, with DEI being pulled out, the question of how can we help support people to feel that they belong in the institutions where they work as well as where they seek care. So we think about these in terms of both like in a hospital context, I think about them in the patients I serve, but I also think about them in the nurses and the doctors that I work with. When people don't feel that their values are being respected, it can feel like a loss of control. They can come up with things around blaming and demanding, or we can help people to feel that their values are back in the driver's seat. It can make a huge difference in those. When people don't have awe, there can be a disrespect for their self and for others, and they can become consumed in the moment. And people don't have rhythm and routine. There's a sense of being unsettled, unmoored, unanchored that comes. Pass it back to you, Nora, and if you could lift up where the word chaplain comes from and how we got to here.
absolutely. Can you go one slide forward, please? Okay, so I want to just, before we talk about the specific domains of Islamic chaplaincy, I actually want to talk about the term, right? If you all are linguistics majors, etymology, it's important that we use terms, right? And same in Arabic, right? Like a lot of Arabic terms can be traced to triliteral roots. So the word chaplain derives from the Latin capellanus, which originally referred to the guardian of the sacred coat, capa or capella, belonging to Saint Martin of Tours. And as chaplains will actually share in this book, Mantle of Mercy, and I know you can't really see it clearly because of my blurred screen, but inshallah, we're going to share it in the resources page. Khadija radiallahu anha, may Allah be pleased with her, the Prophet's wife, right? His wife, who he was married to for 25 years, when he received revelation, she covered him. He said to her, Zammiluni, Zammiluni, right? Cover me, cover me. And so we actually see Khadija being the first chaplain, right? She was comforting her husband. She was providing him with presents. Now, and the term chaplain in the United States, North America, the context that we live and work in, does have a Christian origin. And as time has passed, as Jay alluded to, the 1960s and even earlier, the Muslim community has recognized that new roles are needed, right? Maybe we have the Qadi, the Mufti, and many of our countries of origin, but we know that it's different in the United States, right? So Muslim chaplains fill a need that exists in America, and we're going to talk more about how there is overlapping in different roles with the imam. And with that being said, I will now talk specifically about the different types of chaplaincy. So, Jay, you want to take healthcare?
The role of chaplains looks so different in different moments and across different institutions. We could talk all afternoon and only scratch the surface of the work that chaplains do, but we thought it might be helpful to hold up one example of the role that chaplains play in each of the different institutional settings as sort of mini case studies as a foundation for further conversation. So looking back at the spiritual needs that we shared earlier, an example of that from my own work as a healthcare chaplain, a few years ago, I had a patient who was, he'd had a catastrophic heart event and was really not participating in the physical therapy and recovery work that's needed. He was a lot younger than a lot of the patients who come through our unit for cardiac surgery things. And the nurses were pretty frustrated. There was a sense of like, why isn't he just getting up? And when I hear the nurses feeling frustrated with patients, that's usually a good indicator for me. I need to go check in and see what's going on. And for this particular gentleman, he, as he shared his story and began to kind of tell me the story that he had wrapped his experience in, it was that he had had an affair and that God's way of punishing him was this heart attack and that he was not supposed to have survived it. So the whole story he was telling himself is that God has punished me. I am not meant to survive this. I should die as a result of what I have done. Now, this man is not Muslim. And so it presented an opportunity for me to invite him to share his own understanding of what we call an theodicy, which is essentially the theology, the meaning of like why do bad things happen to people. So this looks at in the meaning and purpose of what he has made the story to be. I invited that from the Islamic tradition, when we think of hardships as occurring, that they are opportunities, and that if we respond with sabr, right, patience, steadfast patience, tawakkul, trust in Allah, and taqwa, that constant mindfulness of God, that's an opportunity for purification, cleansing of our sins, expiation. Just as a not an imposition, but a curious dialogue back and forth about that opened up spaces for seeing that perhaps even within his own theology, this experience could have happened differently. We did a lot of work around grief, around holding space for mistakes, around his understanding of redemption in his own Christian tradition, and he began to participate in his care. We were able to help with relationship restoration with his wife. And actually, before they left, they did a renewal of vows and a re-exchanging of the rings that they had stopped wearing. Had we not been able to hone in and shift the story that he was telling himself, I don't think that he would be alive today. So that's one example of some of the work that I do with accompanying in a healthcare situation. And I'm going to pass it over to Nora to share another example.
Thank you so much, Jay. So I'm actually going to skip to military and university just for the sake of time. So there's a really wonderful documentary that came out, I think 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, called Three Chaplains, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, but I'm not sure if it's PBS. It was streamed on PBS, right? So it's about three Muslim chaplains who are in the military. And so one of the stories that came out was about beard accommodations. Um, the lihya, as we say in Arabic. And so one of the chaplains who's in the film, Rafael Antigua, Chaplain Rafael, there was a chaplain who really wanted to have like a long, excuse me, not a chaplain, a service member who really wanted to have a long beard. And I believe at the time Chaplain Raphael was trying to grapple with, well, like it's a sunnah, right? Like you don't have to have the beard. I mean, a lot of scholars will say that. And as he discussed and the film kind of talks about, and he grappled with his own like understanding of, meeting people where they're at as a chaplain, that the chaplain is still, yeah, we are still as chaplains legally responsible for advocating for beard accommodations, though, even though the beard is sunnah, right? And so this story represents the legal, civic, and the religious and spiritual intersecting, and the importance of the First Amendment, which is such an important amendment for all of us, but especially as chaplains, right? Which there's the 5 F's in the First Amendment, how I learned it. One of them is the freedom of religion, which is the separation of church and state. And then I'm just going to do university quickly. So my primary place that I've worked is the university setting, right? The education setting. And I want to talk about belonging. So Ramadan is a beautiful month where, if you're a student, you're maybe the Muslim Student Association, food is a large part of Ramadan, right? Yes, even though we're fasting from Ramadan, we're breaking our fast in Ramadan for iftars. And a lot of MSAs, a lot of Muslim student associations are largely Arab and South Asian in their student makeup. And there's a story about an African American student, a Muslim woman, who was actually very active in the MSA, but felt like, yes, there was definitely those two ethnic groups were dominated, and they only wanted to have certain foods, samosa, falafel, biryani, etc. And so we talked about, okay, wait a minute, like this is not the spirit of Ramadan to only have it like think about these foods, right? We have to include, Jay talked about DEI, inclusivity. So we talked through it with the students, and we talked about anti-racism, right? As Muslims, that is so important. As Muslims, right? I mean, as human beings. And still, even though we preach against anti-racism, we preach against racism as Muslims, we still have this jahiliyyah, unfortunately, anti-blackness in our communities. And then we talked about what about bean pie, which if those of you who don't know, bean pie was made by the Nation of Islam. So not just theory, but embodied practice. Please go ahead, Jay.
Um, my husband is a corrections chaplain, and my connection to Kurdish heritage. I should have named this at the beginning, but I am a white convert to Islam. Um, One of the things that he thinks a lot about is what it means to be in acceptance with the situation that one has. People end up in this country incarcerated for all kinds of reasons. Oftentimes, racism and injustice are involved in that process at some point along the way. Before people can move into a space of accepting where they are at and finding the meaning and the purpose in those stories, there can be a process of grief, being able to support people through that as they can then move to the meaning and purpose. And so for him, sometimes a part of acceptance looks like holding space for people to name the injustices and those experiences that have come through, to name where they may have made mistakes themselves, and to be able to reconcile that and to find the capacity to forgive themselves, to forgive others, to seek forgiveness from those who they have harmed. Once people move into a place of acceptance, there's incredible possibility for people to do theological meaning making around the space that they're in. One part of the work of corrections chaplains is when death notifications come in for family on the outside, there needs to be a confirmation process to confirm it. And then a person receives a chaplain visit and a phone call home. Sitting with those people is some of the hardest moments in terms of the work of a chaplain, because oftentimes things have happened that lead there to not be resolution in people's lives. When one's mother or child dies and they are incarcerated and haven't had the opportunity to have the conversations or to hold the hands, there's tremendous grief that comes into those spaces. And then it looks like ongoing pastoral counseling following that as they work through that grief process. And Nora said this earlier, but just to reiterate, like for a chaplain who's working in a corrections environment, they are doing that with people regardless of their faith tradition. If you're the chaplain who's on when a death notification comes on, you're the chaplain who responds to that. I also want to talk about community chaplaincy around the spiritual need of awe So as Nora explained, this connecting with that transcendence, for us, that looks like connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We often think when people are in the midst of a hard spot, life is rough, people tend to turn inward, and the sort of vision of the extent of the world can become much more narrow. And a part of awe is helping people to open up and to reconnect with Allah and with Allah's creation. So one way that community chaplains do that is through holding group programs. So for example, for new moms, for those who are on a grief journey, for those who may be on a divorce journey, to help reconnect and just broaden understanding and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another way that that can happen is for people who may be struggling with body image and with eating disorders, right? To be able to connect the body is an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what does it look like if we begin to open up space to see our bodies as something beautiful and something to be caretaken simply because they come from Allah. So finding those connection places. And again, these all sort of link in, right? So that enables a process of meaning making. There's acceptance in that journey as well. And then lastly, I want to name rhythm and routine. So this rhythm and routine is my addition to the spiritual needs. It's not on the like formal list, but it's one that I advocate for because I think it's really important. And as Nora said earlier, I think COVID was a really great example of that, right? When we lose our rhythm and routine, oftentimes we see people lose response flexibility, which means they become much more rigid in how they're engaging things because they're seeking to control what little they can control. And when we can find places such as chaplains to help introduce control, it can help increase response flexibility that comes up. One of the things also is just sort of noticing it. Alhamdulillah, we fast for Ramadan, which has given me a really great awareness of the disorientation that comes when you don't eat. And so often for my patients coming out of surgery in the ICU, they've gone 3 days, they're not actually hungry. So they haven't necessarily realized that they are missing that routine of eating 3 meals a day. And once we are able to name it, it's like this light bulb going off. Like, oh, yeah, that's what's going on. And then what does it look like to draw from the Islamic tradition of introducing, well, like, let's make sure that there's a pause for prayer, lifting up gratitude to God for having come this far 3 times a day to fill that space. So turning towards spiritual nourishment instead of merely the absence of physical nourishment. Nora, unless you have anything to add, I think we can move on to the next slide.
Yes, please. Next slide. Thank you. So overlapping in different roles of a chaplain and imam. So the sister on the left, her name is actually Chaplain Nisa Muhammad, Dr. Nisa Muhammad. She is the Muslim and chaplain, because again, as we've come to learn now, chaplain does not have to only be Muslim, of Howard University, which is a historic Black university. And this is an imam. I'm sorry, I don't know who this is. I just got it from the internet. But as you can see, this is our beloved imam, our sheikh, leading us in prayer. So how do the chaplain and the imam's roles differ? Because as I shared earlier, there are similarities and differences. So there is, when people contact someone, such as a mufti, the mufti's job, or the muftiya, because a mufti can be a male or female, the job is to give their interpretation of their shari, their legal sharia obligation, right? When you're preaching at the masjid, doing a khutbah as an imam, your job is to uphold Islam as the person understands it. And then similar, now a chaplain is a little bit different because the imam is often in the vicinity of a masjid, right? And a chaplain, however, as we just explained, can go into those 5 or 6 areas. And also gender. So as you noticed, Jay and I are both women. Alhamdulillah, we're Muslim women chaplains, right? And we cannot be imams because we do not lead the salah. Now, I'm not talking about the different madhahib, and I know Hanafi, and we're not going to get into that, right? But importantly, our accompaniment is a very large difference with an imam. And by the way, I love our imams. I hope this doesn't, I'm just sharing that I love and I support our imams. We need them. And we also need to understand that there's text and context, right? So some of the imams who were trained at Al-Azhar University in Egypt, or some ilahiyat in Turkey, for example, they have to understand that just coming, to, I don't know, Chicago, Illinois, you have to have humility and understand that you have to understand the context that you're working in. So accompaniment. We're not necessarily teaching isnads, right? Transmission or granting ijazas, which is certification. but we're accompanying a person through a learning experience, through a moment of grief, through a moment of sorrow, through a moment of transition. And the core idea of chaplaincy is that people have the answers within and their own self capacity, but we have to help them with a calm, spiritual, truthful, and sincere presence to help them with that. And I know that I think somebody in this room here, mashallah, I know Maysoon, she is in the field of mental health, for example. And so chaplaincy is a bridge to mental health care, right? There are some chaplains who have licensed clinical counseling, but most of us, we are trained to recognize when we need to give referrals to support mental health, and we can do parallel accompaniment. And what I really also want to share is about a chaplain. We try to also take into mind someone's biopsychosocial, like a holistic approach to somebody. So again, we're not trained clinicians, we're not imams, but we have training. And we'll hear terms like pastoral from the word pastor. And this idea actually is in our faith tradition, right? Our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, every person is a shepherd to their flock. Now, this means literally like you can be a shepherd, you can be someone who's in charge, nurturing to your family. We take it as chaplains to the people who come to us seeking compassion, seeking meaning making. And then one last thing I just want to share about being a woman is that for example, I mentioned Khadija radiallahu anha earlier, and I also think about the example of Aisha, our Prophet's other wife later in his life. May Allah be pleased with her. She preserved one third of the Hadith tradition, right? And while we may not use the term chaplain, just the importance and complementary roles of men and women, right? The imams are, well, because of our tradition, mostly male, right? And chaplains as women, excuse me, we women, myself, Jay, others, we can be chaplains and again complement one another. Next slide, please.
So if something you have heard today makes you think that there is somebody in your life, or perhaps yourself, who has a calling as a Muslim chaplain, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what the sort of normal professional pathway is to get there. Alhamdulillah, people have come through many different ways into chaplaincy, but if one is just starting out and the perhaps path of greatest ease is to, one, start out and make sure you have a solid foundation in your Islamic sciences. The graduate training programs that teach Islamic chaplaincy are in some ways a little bit like finishing school, the idea being that you learn your Islam in the community, and then they provide the academic framework of Islamic studies and of practical chaplaincy skills. So Islamic studies as a subset of religious studies, which is a field that's looking at history, literature, sociology, et cetera, in terms of how we understand things, which is a little bit different than going to some place and getting a solid grasp on fiqh and usul fiqh across different traditions. And then the graduate program, and I'll put a link here that has more information. And there's 5 different programs currently in the United States and 2 programs in Canada offering graduate degrees in Islamic chaplaincy that are accredited. And then the last component of it is what Nora referenced earlier is clinical pastoral education, also known as CPE. Typically, the CPE setting is in a healthcare institution. I am biased as a hospital chaplain, but I do think that for anybody who can learn in a hospital environment, it is one of the best places to do CPE because it puts you in situations that are literally life or death, and just present a lot of opportunities for reflection and theological development and learning oneself a little bit more. And in CPE, it's really a place to understand how your own lived experience impacts the care that you give, to be acutely aware of patterns of what we call transference and countertransference, the ability to recognize when a patient is navigating with you differently, or a care seeker is navigating with you differently because you remind them of somebody, and that can be good or that can be bad. And countertransference, where is that coming up for me? Am I oversharing with somebody because she reminds me of my grandma? But that's not the right box to be in. I need to go find somebody else I can talk to who's in the friend category. That shouldn't be coming across over with a patient. The other thing that I think is really valuable about clinical pastoral education is that it is a space to practice the skills of counseling that you have learned in the academic training with the support of supervision. So somebody, a trained educator, as well as your cohort mates, working through things to understand, going from a classroom of brain learning to the actual heart application of those skills in a classroom setting. Depending on the different field of chaplaincy that one goes into, depends on what the educational requirements are for that. So for example, if somebody wants to be a healthcare chaplain, typically it requires a Master's of Divinity degree, 4 units of clinical pastoral education, which is effectively a full year, and then to go through a process of endorsement and board certification. And for endorsement, because of the separation of church and state that we have in this country, and chaplaincy having initially sort of really been in these government institutions, there's a requirement that a faith-based organization essentially sign off on a chaplain meeting the criteria of that religious community to be in a position of service as a chaplain. Within the world of endorsement for Muslim chaplains, we have a variety of organizations, including those like the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Endorsement Council. There's a new group, the Ilm Foundation out in Connecticut. They're typically looking that a person has the religious competencies and foundational chaplaincy training to be able to represent their institution as an endorsed chaplain. And then for those who advance to becoming a professional healthcare chaplain, there's a requirement called board certification, where one demonstrates mastery of a set of I should know this. It's either 26 or 36 core competencies, and that's done through essays and through interviews, including being able to bring in case studies from our work in a hospital setting to demonstrate mastery of those competencies. Again, healthcare is sort of the highest level of training requirements, but you see variations of those exist throughout the different fields of chaplaincy. I think with that, we can look at these resources real quick and then open up for Q&A. Nora, do you want to run through these real quick?
Yes, yes. And I wanted to actually show them the book. So this is the book that I was talking about earlier, which was actually, mashallah, Jay is one of the editors. So it's called Mantle of Mercy. So it's a compilation of essays written by different chaplains about all the things that we've talked about and so much more. It's like, mashallah, I think 20 something chapters. So please do get a copy of that book. The Three Chaplains film that we talked about earlier, it's a documentary about 3 Muslim chaplains in the military. Musings of a Muslim Chaplain by Sundus Kolaki. It's a beautiful, beautiful book about her time as a hospital chaplain. And Sundus Kolaki, mashallah, she does a lot of great writing on combining chaplaincy, spirituality, Islam, and in the hospital setting. And then, as Jay mentioned earlier, the Association of Muslim Chaplains, I'm a member of that. It's extremely important to belong to institutions for affiliation, for ethics, right? To make sure that you're, not an unethical person doing this kind of thing. And there's also, as she wrote here, there's MEC, Muslim Endorsement, and then Journal of Islamic Faith and Practice, because we also want to make sure that we are able to publish what we're talking about. I know a lot of times chaplaincy can, I don't know, some people just like, it seems willy-nilly, like, and it's actually, I mean, no, it's from the heart, right? I mean, how at the same time, we really need to make sure that we're publishing. And there's the recent publication of this actually has so many articles. It was actually a focus feature on chaplaincy, and it's free. So please make sure that you check that out. And so, yeah, so with that being said, thank you. Tashakkur Idris, Spaz, and we would love to welcome questions right now about anything that we've covered. Any clarification, please go ahead.
So we're waiting for questions to come in. I think one of the other areas that I just would like to lift up is that a huge role of Muslim chaplains in North American institutions right now looks like advocacy. So if you or a loved one are in an institutional setting and you are experiencing bias or discrimination or a lack of accommodation, the chaplains are there to help. And a chaplain of any faith tradition should be able to support you in that process. So a lot of my work here is being able to recognize when bias is coming up in healthcare situations to be able to help address those to ensure that we have equitable care for people. And I do that for Muslims, but I do it for all other people as well. And certainly college campuses have a lot of that. Military corrections, I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but it's worth giving gratitude to particularly men who were incarcerated in our system who either were Muslim or who came into Islam, have done a lot of the legal groundwork that has enabled the protection of religious freedoms for those of us on the outside as well in this country.
Thank you, Nora and Jay, for your inspiring presentations. We will now begin the Q&A portion of our event. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box. You may also raise your hand on Zoom if you'd like to ask your question directly. While we wait for some questions to come in, I'll start with my own. I have two questions. One, I am a hospitalist, so I'm internal medicine in the hospital. I do have chaplains that I talk to about patients. I thought it would be an interesting, you kind of touched on having a master's in divinity. I think for people who don't know what chaplains do, it's really nice to make that distinction between theology and chaplaincy. So I didn't know if you could touch a little bit more on that. I think people would think that if you walk into a room wearing a hijab, people are going to start debating you, but that's not the case. I've had my own patients, for example, once they see that you're spiritual, it actually lets them feel more comfortable to start telling you their spiritual side. So that was my first question. And then my second question is about you two. In medicine, we use some words like moral injury, compassion fatigue. I wanted to hear about, chaplains and how they are able to deal with all of the stories and the situations that they witness. And I hope that you two are also, you have a support system as well.
Yeah.
Jay, I feel more comfortable with the first question, or whatever. Whatever.
Go for it.
I feel like you could take I feel like the second one is more up your alley, I think. Okay, so about the training, Connie. So a Master of Divinity is something that is, yeah, that's the degree that most places will require. There's also like a THD, I think that Harvard Divinity School offers it. And so theology and chaplaincy. So kalam, right, theology in our faith, that is important, right? But so as a Muslim, like let me just share really quickly. You may be like, why did she get an MDiv and an MA? So I got an MDiv from University of Chicago, which while it's marketed to, and I've talked with Jay about this, marketed to like all people, I'm like, it's actually still Christian oriented, which has pros and cons, right? Now, I went and so I felt like I got a lot about chaplaincy, alhamdulillah, but I still felt like as a Muslim, I need to understand more about my faith tradition, about theodicy, as Jay said, about shar and evil, and why do bad things happen, and how do like we talk about this to people, and so I'm not here to do dawah. I'm not here to preach to people, right? And that's something beautiful about chaplaincy is that people have the agency to say no. So like at a hospital setting, if a person wants to say no to me, okay, ahlan wa sahlan, that's okay. If you don't like me because I'm muhajjaba, that's okay. I mean, yes, is there Islamophobia potentially? Maybe. That's very possible. But I'm in this field to be able to, hopefully be emotionally mature to be like, okay, this person does not maybe want to see someone who looks like me right now. That's okay. And then, yeah, so I hope that kind of helped you, Connie. And I think, yeah, I think Jay would be better equipped than me to answer the second question that you asked.
Am I correct in the second question sort of being like, how do we care for ourselves to be able to do this work for the long haul?
Yes.
Yeah. So the most important part for me is having the self-awareness to be able to recognize where I'm starting to experience, or if I'm starting to experience burnout, so that I can make sure that I get things in place. Joy is a really big part of self-care for me. I have a wonderful circle of friends, and we get together once a week for brunch or for dinner. We play board games, we laugh. It helps to sustain us through the experience of being Muslim in America, and doing really heavy lifting. I have two small children. I cannot bring work home with me. I may, occasionally I may jump on a phone and consult with doctors if we have a situation with a Muslim that warrants it, but like the emotional stuff of work has to stay at work. So for me, one of the ways that I do that is if I've had a case that has like brought up grief for me, I'll put on sad music on my commute home, and I'll give myself like, however long that song goes to cry. And then I switch over to something a little bit more upbeat so that when I walk in, I can be fully there for my kids. At this particular juncture of life, both of my kids have some special needs. So the parenting workload is a little significant. So I'm choosing to work part-time, which I'm privileged to be able to do that, but has helped me to maintain that well-being, and physical activity. Is also really important. And I'm super geeky. I love reading. So like go sit in a cafe with a book and read and journal about what I'm reading is like my ideal soul care, if you will.
Okay, and I'm going to turn to the chat box. I see some hands being raised. Let me go with the chat box first because I think that question came up first. So this is from Maysoon. Thank you so much for your presentation and your experience. What mental health struggles do Muslims most commonly bring to chaplaincy spaces? And also those who are not Muslim, what are some things they bring in your spaces to look for guidance?
A big part of our training is to be able to recognize and refer around mental health. And so we don't do direct mental health counseling, but we are often the first point of contact that people have. That's either because of, the stigma that exists in Muslim community can be really high. And so approaching us might be more of a valid starting point in somebody's mind to then be able to help do the hand-holding to get a successful referral through. It also has to do with, frankly, the spaces that we exist in. We are often the sort of crisis responders that then are doing the triage and workup. In my own context of working in a hospital, I see a lot of suicidality because of who's ending up in the hospital. So we have an inpatient unit here. We have a mental health emergency room. And that is something that I would say over the past 2 years has been one of the more prevalent things that I've seen. I work within a team context, right? So people are getting mental health support, and then I'm doing the parallel accompaniment, both in the emergency room context and in setting. I would also say that we sort of another area that we've seen is just depression in general, where people are struggling for a multitude of reasons.
And I just want to add, so when a student talks to me for like a one-on-one session, right, with Chaplain Nura, oftentimes they'll open up and I'll actually come to realize they need, like Jay just said, a referral. Like I can, like they'll open up and I'm so thankful that they'll come to me, that they feel that I'm a safe and trusted space. And so I realized like, okay, this is the limits of my capacity, my training. I hear you, I see you, and I will give you resources. Now it's on them if they're going to follow up. They may not take my referral. They may need more time. But I would say in terms of like university settings, I mean anxiety, just how much people have to perform. It's a lot of pressure, right? And after COVID-19, I'm an adjunct professor with ICE raids. I work at an institution that is a Hispanic serving institution. A lot of students understandably felt a lot of fear and they didn't want to come to class, right? So angst, anxiety, and then I'm just trying to understand Mason's second point. What are some things they can bring? Cultural humility. We talked about DEI, pardon. Sometimes the term uses Jedi to bring in the term justice, right? Justice, equity. I know, isn't that amazing? Diversity, inclusivity, right? And we need to understand that for a Muslim person who maybe is, I don't know, like Arab American, right? And it's a man. You need to not just respect his gender and ethnicity, but he's also Muslim. And sometimes these DEI spaces, and even in mental health, I've learned they don't necessarily want to talk about your faith tradition. So if you want to be a practitioner to see the whole person, don't shy away from their faith tradition because maybe their faith tradition can actually help them with healing. So that's what I would just say to that question.
Thank you.
The other thing I would add is that sometimes talking to a chaplain outside of your faith tradition can really help. One of the core things that we're trained in is non-judgmental presence, but people come in and they have a lot of assumptions about chaplains from their own faith tradition. So, for example, a Catholic patient who is experiencing perinatal loss and who would like to have a baptism for their baby, that's out of the norms of what a Catholic priest can provide. Whereas I have the capacity to provide coaching for a family to facilitate that baptism themselves. That looks really different. It doesn't look like me doing the baptism, but it looks like me kind of walking them through the process if that's something important for them, or to help them construct a blessing ceremony that would be both within the bounds of their faith, but also would meet the need that they're feeling in that moment in time and place.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Ibrahim, I think your hand went up first, so we can get your question.
Yes, I am already tired holding my hand. Thank you. Thank you, Nora and Jay. Listening to you, it was a dream for me came true. Thinking back in 25 years ago, when I was visiting scholar at Harvard Seminary with Ibrahim Abu Rabi, And this was a totally new issue for Muslim chaplaincy. And then we just encouraged many young Muslims to just to apply for chaplaincy program. When I went back to Turkey, I also, advised my students at the divinity school I said, you can go and you can study at Harvard Seminary and others. You can have a job as a chaplaincy. Now I see some of my students, they are leading chaplains here. So thank you. But at that time, all they were male. But now you are two female sisters. You are doing a great job. I was so little bit emotional when listening to you. Alhamdulillah, with a lot of promise, and when we look at the future. But a problem is that when I was, in Boston 2 years ago, I just applied a prison, where Malcolm X, rahimahullah, imprisoned for 7 years, Norfolk, prison at Norfolk. I said, I want to I want to volunteer to give a course on mindfulness for prisoners as a professor of philosophy. It took 3 or 4 months to decide for the administration what the professor of philosophy will do with this course. Then I provided what they asked me. But when I was there, I just every week, I drove almost 50 minutes a drive. I was the only Muslim volunteer. And there was, many of other volunteers from different Christian groups, even secular people, etc., etc. So I want to ask you, what is the reason why the Muslim they don't volunteer to help these people to help chaplains, chaplains, and then I realized they are doing a great job, and they were very lucky at this prison. Our chaplain was graduate for Azhar University. And at the end of my 8 week, seminars, they told me, if we meet you before, we will not be here. So it means, there's a lot of things we can do for these people, and also we can help chaplains. I would like to, to answer, because many people will listen to you, inshallah, through the social media, how we can be a part of your job, both in prison for incarcerated people, or for you in hospitals. What is the role of volunteers and what we can do? Thank you.
I would begin by saying the reason that Muslim organizations, and like Masajid and Muslims at large, are not more involved in the prison is, quite frankly, anti-Black racism is a huge driving factor on that. There are some phenomenal prison support programs and reentry support programs. They are much more common in Black Muslim communities. And I think that there's so much learning that our Masajid could do from those that are doing this really important work. I know, and then I also know, like, it's been hard to get Muslims volunteers to go visit those who are in ICE detention, and that is because people are concerned that they too will become detained. And so I want to also hold up that injustice that's preventing our siblings from having support through volunteers in ICE detention situations. In terms of thinking about what are the ways that non-chaplains can support those who are institutionalized, there's some really great opportunities. Volunteers across the country going and providing a khutbah and a halaqah for those who are incarcerated can make a huge difference with a connection to the outside. Those who can volunteer to come in and teach a class. When we look at healthcare institutions, there's an organization called ANIS, and I can put their link in the chat, that helps do what I would call sort of social informational visits to patients to make sure that they have the prayer supplies that they need, answer any questions about religious accommodations. And when they identify somebody who is alone and needs social support, they can collaborate with the chaplains to make sure that those needs are met. One of the other areas is because of the professional code of ethics for chaplains prevents us from doing dawah work. But dawah work has a really important role in a lot of institutions and American campuses, and that's someplace where Masajid volunteers can be a really important part of the sort of larger picture of what it means to care for Muslim communities. Nora, do you want to add also?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Brother Ibrahim. May Allah bless us all. And, in the words of actually the book, again from here, Mantle of Mercy, Chaplain Suhaib Sultan, Rahimahullah, may we be companions, not competitors. Wallahi, we have to think this way. I mean, I also think one of the reasons we don't do much volunteering is because some of us may feel like we're not still part of this community if we're immigrants and it's a shame because our Prophet, peace be upon him, like when he was in a place he was established himself. He helped his neighbor, right? I mean, how many of the hadith that look Surah Al-Ma'un, right? For the sake of time, I won't quote it in Arabic, but wasn't there a hadith that uh, how can you go to bed if your neighbor is hungry? And I'll be the first one to like check myself first, right? So I think we also need to remind ourselves start with the small deeds, right? And as Jay said, like anti-blackness, unfortunately, I want to write something when I'm done of my own colleague from Bayan Islamic Graduate School. Her name is Ruqayyat Yaqub, and she does work on heart work for Muslim masajid, for schools on anti-blackness from an Islamic perspective and how we can heal that, right? So I also would like to bring that up. But inshallah, Brother Ibrahim, we are going to see where like wallahi, one person said she's a doctor, she's a mother of four. She said, Wallahi, you chaplains are saving the souls of American Muslim youth. And I'm like, Allahu A'la, inshallah, Bismillah, right? Because it's Allah's fadl, right? We make dua every day to Allah to keep us on the sirat al-mustaqim. And, right, like we need to have more of us chaplains stepping up because the needs are great. Islamophobia is on the rise. There's confusion. I think actually one in every four Muslims will leave the faith. So yeah, we have to take this work as a sadaqah, not a sadaqah, excuse me, a fard kifaya. This is a communal obligation. Allahu a'lam. And I think Sister Rachel had her hand up, Connie.
Yes, I was gonna go to Rachel, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll even be visible. Thank you so much, both of you. It was a great presentation. I really learned and enjoyed. I was struck, I think both of you, when you were talking about situations that you'd encountered in different institutional settings, you brought up the idea of speaking with a patient, a client who was not Muslim, and drawing them into conversation by using concepts or mentioning historical figures who do come out of an Islamic tradition. And it struck me that this is really important because one of the ways that Islamophobia in America has tended to work is to say that Islam is not a religion. Islam is something about ethnicity, or Islam is something about politics. And so I wonder if you have thoughts, I mean, if you're intentional in the way you bring forward spiritual concepts that are rooted specifically in Islam, but if you have a sense that you're, expanding a shared vocabulary for Americans, and that, this is something that helps the Muslim community, also just helps people who need to expand their spiritual toolbox when they're dealing with difficulties in life. Is that something that you have thoughts on or a stance on?
We're doing the eyes back and forth. So he's going to step for his eye actor. So one of my interventions is one of my chaplaincy interventions is what I call the dumb Muslim card, where I will sort of invite curiosity as though I don't know Christian or Jewish teachings around these things. Like part of training for chaplaincy is you learn about other faith traditions, right? So that has been integrated into my training for this. But to just sort of say, coming from my own tradition, this is how we think about it. How do you think about it? Or even not starting with Islam, but starting with how do you understand suffering in your faith tradition? The invitation to educate me can fundamentally help root a person who's unmoored, right? They may have been thinking about suffering purely in a worldly way. And when I ask them to explain suffering to me through the lens of their Christianity, it helps remind them of what is relevant and important to them. being an intervention of itself. But then there's also kind of an opportunity. There's so many different Christian teachings, right? And similarly, a lot of those have different intersections with Islamic points to just sort of invite curiosity of like, oh, like that's fascinating. We have this. And it's not an imposition, it's just an invitation to sort of explore further that I think can be really beneficial to people wherever they're at.
I know it's 1 o'clock, Connie, so I'll be really fast. Okay, 1:01 p.m. Central. So, Sister Rachel, I also think I mean, I love what you use that term, like expanding a spiritual toolbox vocabulary for Americans. I think that's just really cool. Like there's an interview with Anne Hathaway. She said inshallah in her interview. I don't know. I'm not really big on pop culture. I just saw it and I was like, interesting. But I do know, not but I do know that Islamophobia is part of this country. I mean, Christopher Columbus, he actually was, I mean, Christopher Columbus, part of the Crusades against Islam. And this is not to demonize. I mean, I'm an American. This is my country. We're all here, right? And we can also speak truth to power, right? And recognize that, yes, Islamophobia is unfortunately a part of parcel of this country. There's a great book by Khalid Beydoun called American Islamophobia. And unfortunately, our faith is off. Islam is racialized all the time. And it's so sad because subhanAllah, you know, Islam is, well, if you believe it, it's a continuation of the Abrahamic tradition. And we're in the 10 days of the Hijjah, right? We are in the days of fasting, inshallah, if we're able to, of thinking of sacrifice, of orient ourselves to the divine, right? And Prophet Abraham, alayhi salam, right? He is our role model for this. And we know that the traditions of what would become Judaism, Christianity, and Islam come from him. So unfortunately, it's ignorance. It's part of the media. There is, and we know this, right? I mean, an Arab American Christian, I'm forgetting his name, unfortunately, but he wrote a book called Real Bad Arabs, Reel. So we have a lot of work to do, inshallah. And inshallah, our field as chaplains is one way to combat it, inshallah.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to wrap up if there's any other questions or comments. You guys are amazing. So that will conclude our Q&A session. If you would like to rewatch the panel, a recording will soon be available on Zahra Institute's YouTube and Facebook pages. And with that, we conclude Zahra Institute's Spring 2026 Speaker Series. To stay updated on our future events and programming, please follow Zahra Institute on YouTube and social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you again in September when we relaunch our Fall Speaker Series.
Inshallah. Thank you. Eid Mubarak coming up soon. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
I will share a story if you guys want to hear it real quick. So when you're talking about the patient who renewed his vows, it reminded me of one of my patients. He had, so it was new diagnosed esophageal cancer. And this is kind of the spirituality and things that happen in a hospital, you know? So I was talking to him and I said, well, who, you know, are you married? And he said, well, she might as well be my wife. And I said, okay, what does that mean? And she said, well, we've been together for over 20 years. And I said, okay, but if you're not legally married, she can't make decisions for you. And so you have esophageal cancer. Like there's a lot that's about to happen. And it was so interesting because I was the hospitalist and then the GI doctor was Jewish and was wearing a yarmulke. And so one morning we're sitting together and, you know, it's always hard as a doctor because you don't want to ask too many. It's interesting, right? Because for my role, I don't want to ask too many personal questions because I need to be objective. For you guys, you need to ask those personal questions so you can understand better. So I'm kind of like, okay, I think that's enough of the diving into the personal story. And so when I was walking up to him to kind of do a physical exam and just tell him, you know, what the plan was, he just keeps looking at me and he's like, I know what God's doing. And he was, I would say Rastafarian or Caribbean, you know, more of that culture. And he said, God sent me his people. You think I don't see you and my other doctor? Like, and it was very interesting because to him, it was like a sign that I was wearing a scarf. He was wearing a yarmulke. He's like, God's sending me his people. And it was so powerful for me. And he got married in the hospital. And so the next day, the nurse was telling me, like, what did you say to the patient? Because he got married last night.
Connie, you have to have a new profession now. Khalas. I mean, just
But you know, those moments do happen and they're very impactful. And you're like, okay, you know, I'm glad, you know, what you give sometimes and what people take, you hope that it's the same. But sometimes you never know how people take your words.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But thank you both for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You know, one thing I didn't talk about, but that is also increasingly something hospital chaplains are thinking about, is how we support our Muslim medical school students and our residents and fellows. So we do a together time dinner once a month for our Muslim residents and fellows come over for dinner. We alternate. One month they bring their families, and the other month we do just trainees, just as an opportunity to have some spiritual social support through companionship, because it can be so hard. And also like coaching them and giving them the ability to say, if you want somebody to do something on Muslim patients, you need to call the chaplain. That's not my wheelhouse. Or giving them the tools to help them speak to that if they want to lean into that space a little bit more.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you all. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Shahri.
you. Terima kasih.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum.